if you're trans and at the post office, you're by yourself in your office, you're listening to this, you're not alone. This is a postal workers podcast. People may not know a lot about trans people. And there's a lot of things that you hear in the media, a lot of things you hear online about us. Um, so I want to talk about like what are trans people and why does everyone hate us so much? Not everyone. Most people, I think, are pretty normal. I'm Mara Cahill. I'm a carrier out of Philadelphia, Keystone Branch 157. I've been working for the post office for about a year and a half. I'm a trans woman, and I guess that is my expertise here.
I am Kai, she, her pronouns. I am a PTF, part-time flexible letter carrier out of Pittsburgh, local branch 84. I'm a trans woman. I've been out and trans for upwards of 8 to 9 years now, which basically means I'm a trans elder in certain circles, which is an interesting thing. And yeah, I'm also an open socialist, member of Bill Defending NALC, and a member of Socialist Alternative.
To sort of fill in my sort of other things. I've been out as a trans person for about 5 years, so a little less than Kai, and which was before I joined the post office. And I'm not a member of Socialist Alternative, but I am a communist. I think that's relevant for some of what we're going to talk about. So yeah, I think when I think about what a trans person is, like what it means to me, and like what I think it means in societies, that societies have, these sort of systems of like sex and gender roles. And I'm going to use those kind of interchangeably because I think they sort of, in certain ways, refer to the same thing. Um, and those societies, like different societies, have different systems of sex and gender roles, right? Like if you look at history, you look at even right now, different societies have different ways they engage in sex and gender. And so, like, I think that's important because a lot of people will talk about trans people like it's this totally new thing. And no one until the year 2000 was transgendered. And, before that, it was two genders, man and woman. And that's really not true. If you look at basically every human society, I think calling it transgender is like, I'm going to try and do this briefly because there's a lot you can say about this, but calling it transgender is like a little fraught or complicated, but there are people that sort of in basically every human society want to change their gender role or that they're assigned at birth or move between gender roles or do something else with it, like transcend or transgress or, move around the sort of gender roles that are given in a given society, right? And not every society had a problem with this, right? There are plenty of societies. You look at various indigenous societies, you look at various other, in the American context, and you look at various sort of societies like India. You look at various societies, which India, there's a lot of different things. I'll try and not get too into it, but you wouldn't necessarily call them transgender, but there are people that it's fine. You can just if you don't want to be the gender role you're assigned to be, you can change that. So I'll maybe pause there, see if Kai has anything to add on that.
Yeah, thanks, Mara. I think that was a great start, and I will say up front that I really largely agree with a lot of that. I think like the way I would go about explaining it might be a little different, and that's totally fine. A lot of trans people have very different ways of explaining things, and I also think it's really good. I'm really happy that we're both on here, and yeah, because I think talking to like more workers, especially more of our NALC coworkers and union siblings having more trans people in their life that they know would be really awesome and would really be helpful for the the trans struggle and for improving the struggle for trans rights. Maybe if I'm trying to talk to one of my coworkers on the shop floor, I'd be like, yeah, like I'm a woman. And like it to me, like what actually recently had a conversation where I was trying to explain and I was like giving my pronouns to one of my coworkers, who was really cool and friendly, but did also like not understand and like wasn't familiar with a lot of the language. And I was like, don't worry, the language to me not nearly as important as the respect. So just like, hey, I'm a woman, and like I need to use the women's restroom. I think I actually brought up something that we'll get into later about the women's restroom, and she was like, she made a really great comment that was basically like, you can use our restroom anytime you want, and I was like, thank you, girl. So yeah, to me, like gender and sex like are so like intertwined, and a lot of people try to like put them in different categories and stuff, and I think it's honestly, I think it can be pretty simple. Obviously, the whole history has a lot of nuance, but I like to be able to like turn to pull some of the basic things out. For me, like one way I would tell someone like if who's asking like what is a trans person, I'd be like, yeah, like if like when you were growing up and like there were men and women, girls and boys, maybe you were fine with that, maybe that made you uncomfortable at some points, maybe not. For trans people, basically what how I understand it is if you're trans, like you feel really uncomfortable with that early on, and like it just to varying degrees, we all have slightly different experiences, but basically you have a lot more discomfort with that, and at some point in your life you make the decision to transition. And to me the transition is a really important part of being trans, because you're really going under you're taking on a very big transformation that could be medical, it could be clothing, it could be names, it could be all these different aspects of our appearance, it could be everything or just one of the options. It doesn't every trans person kind of makes their own way through that. But at some point, you transition and go from and from the outside, that looks like going from one gender to another, or maybe to sort of like this nebulous in between, or what some people would say is another gender. I'm not really going to get into that debate or anything over that right now. But yeah, yeah, okay, the last point I'll say before I finish and right now is just that like that transition and the decision to make that transition is a really personal and deeply serious decision that ultimately for all pretty much all of us who make that decision, it is a life or death decision. It is a decision to save ourselves, perhaps literally from suicide or from other things, other situations, other complicating factors, because our bodies are complicated, and like one thing that's like seems like just an identity question is actually like tied to stress and abuse and all these other things, and is becomes like a deep health issue. For me, I won't go into it right now, but like I can absolutely say that like a lot of my like medical history has a lot to do with being trans, even if it's not like hormone therapy.
Yeah, and yeah, I think that's helpful, sort of grounding us in like the real experience of like what it means to become a trans person. Just to sort of also cap that off, like in some ways it's very complicated, in some ways it's not. Like I'm just a woman, um, and that's yeah. So, and I think like what I'll say is like for me it was absolutely a life and death decision, um, and so yeah, like it's and I know that when I transitioned, like my life has more or less continuously gotten better since. Obviously ups and downs, but the question then is if this is something that's so important to people and something that makes such a big difference in people's lives, what's the problem with us, right? I don't think like this is a personal decision, like this is a thing that like we do for like it's a thing we do because we need to. I think that the issue is we talked about socialists being socialist or communist, right? I think that what that means is that we sort of want to see capitalism replaced with a different system, right? We want to see capitalism replaced with a society like built around from each according to their ability to each according to their need. Part of the reason for that is capitalism relies on exploitation like capitalism is exploitation. And one of the ways that it exploits people is through exploiting women. It exploits women by sort of, without getting into all of this, I'll keep it brief, but it exploits women mostly by keeping them in the home and using their, unpaid labor to, do things like clean and raise children and cook and things like that. And for capitalism to do that effectively, right? And I'm talking about like sort of big trends, right? I'm not talking about capitalism being five guys in a room going, ha ha ha, I'm going to keep women in the home. Though sometimes it's like that. You see the Supreme Court. For capitalism to do that effectively, it needs to be very clear about what a man and what a woman is, right? Because if a section of people are designated for the social role of we exploit you, and and you can't have our property, which is changed in the past century and a half and things like that. But this is the sort of quick and dirty version. So if you're trans, right, if there's an idea that like you can change from being a man into a woman or vice versa, or, man into something else, woman into something else, that undermines that structure.
Definitely want to be clear about the fact that yeah, like like Mara said, I'm a socialist, and to be clear up front, like you don't need to be a socialist to be a part of this conversation. You don't need to be a socialist to be a member of BFN, still defending NALC. You definitely, obviously, don't need to be a socialist to be an NALC member, obviously. Um, and like I think it'll be useful for us to like because for me and Mara especially, like we see how interlinked the struggle to for socialism is definitely a struggle for trans liberation. Like those things are inseparable. I think that's how both of us see that. So like if you're listening to this and you're like it feels like it's going over your head, like definitely like try to be patient. Like when I had a conversation quite recently with one of my workers who voted for Trump, who's honestly a bit anti-union, and I get why he's anti-union because he feels like the union hasn't defended him and his coworkers and has like left them in the dust kind of thing. And I really get that. And in a lot of ways, I agree with some of his points on the need to strengthen the union and have a fighting union. And that's why I'm in BFN. But yeah, we had an open conversation about our views, our politics, and me being a socialist. And like, it was really cool and chill because like, yeah, working people like understand that we all have different ideas right now. And the more we can actually get into open political conversations as a labor movement, as workplaces, as coworkers, like and beyond, like the better we're going to be able to do in terms of yeah like coming up with solid strategies for the labor movement and also understanding ourselves and each other on like a deeper level. Okay, so moving ahead, and I'll finish up soon because I just said a lot. This thing about like human expression, like because I think like one key aspect of being trans is that like all humans are like incredibly cool, and like if we had more resources, if we were freed of the shackles of like the current system and like like the bills we have to pay and the lives we have to live that are like in some ways like they often feel like we're living in a prison that's just like an open air prison in certain ways. Obviously there are more extreme circumstances that would fall under that description, that is, but like it's uneven anyway. Basically my point is that all humans, given the opportunity, the resources, and the chance, would really be doing a lot more cool things, be doing a lot of things differently. And I can see a future where that happens, where I don't know, like the traditional gender norms are like yeah, they probably still like show up in certain ways, but like they're like everyone, absolutely everyone is free to do whatever the fuck they want and live how they want. And I would love like, we're in the US. We're taught from birth that like we have civil liberties and freedom, rah, rah, rah. And like we just also live in a world where we're growing up and seeing how that's not actually true, that a lot of that is a lie. And that but also we can make the world better. Like we can actually do that. And that's like a core piece of my politics. And to like wrap it up, just saying that like the reason I'm a socialist is because I understand that there is going to be no liberation for any oppressed group, whether it be trans people, queer people, black people, immigrants, etc. Like you could keep going on, of course, but like there is no liberation, like complete liberation for any of these groups under this existing system, which profits off of the dividing workers against each other.
I feel like we didn't really talk about this, but just like you brought up BFN, I'm on the coordinating committee for BFN. Kai's member of BFN, supporter. John's also on the coordinating committee for BFN. So yeah, and yeah, BFN supports trans rights. So just talking about this, I guess was supposed to be the intro section, but I think we've kind of gone pretty far. But just to sort of, I think that's a good segue into like, so because of this, like because of this sort of gender norm structure, what happens to trans people? And unfortunately, the world is not very nice to us. And so like sort of top of this, right, it's like physical or sexual violence, right, is very, very common. Like if you look at the statistics, right, and these are just sort of like true facts, right? There are, I'm sure, like a few trans people who have assaulted people in a bathroom, right? There's someone who like shared some stupid link that like an anti-trans legislator put together of like 5 or 6 news stories about this out of like, again, we're talking about we're 1% of the population, which doesn't sound like a lot until you think about that's 3.5 million people in this country alone. Um, so there's a good number of us, and our rates of the rates of violence inflicted on us are substantially higher than violence we inflict on others. And so I think that's more true in the way that violence against cis women is very common, right? Like violence against trans women is even more common. And this is also all like mediated by race as well. Like it's much more difficult to be a black trans person, which I am not, than a white trans person, all that sort of stuff. So like there's that sort of thing, like, and that can come from strangers sometimes. Like I won't get too into it, but I've been assaulted by people on the street. I know, like, we'll get into this more later, but like I know carriers who have been assaulted on the street by customers while they're at work. But also, it can be people right? It can be your family members. A lot of trans people, 40%, I think, of homeless youth are LGBT, because it's really common to get kicked out of your home if you come out to your parents as gay or trans. You can be socially ostracized or bullied. I don't know a single trans person that was not bullied in school. I know I was, even if I didn't know I was trans, there certainly was they can smell it on you, right? We all went to middle school. We all know what it's like to be, we don't all know what it's like, but we all know what happens to the, effeminate kid or whatever. And I think like you see these sorts of things like also manifest in sort of bigger and more structural ways where it's like it's harder for trans people to get housing, right? There's a lot of homeless trans people. There's a lot of trans people in very precarious housing. It's harder for us to get jobs. I myself, since I transitioned, have not gotten a job I had to interview for in person. The post office hired me off the computer. I know that's like very true for a lot of people. I know people, trans women with like master's degrees, but just cannot get a job, right? So there's things like that. And also the medical system puts up like a lot of barriers to accessing like medical transition and medical care in general. There's a phenomenon where like you'll go to the ER for like something completely unrelated, and they'll go, "Oh, you're trans. Well, is this because you're trans?" Right? Like it's called trans broken arm syndrome. They'll blame your hormones or blame whatever. Doctors, nurses are often pretty hostile to you. Not always, but sometimes. Yeah. And so this is I think the general context, right, is if you're a trans person in the world, because we all exist outside of our jobs, right? You come into this is what you're dealing with, right? And you come into work and you come into the post office. One of the things we can talk about, right, is it's very important if you're a trans person, right? Or if you're not a trans person, if you're anyone, social transition is kind of the key, right? Which means like, I ask people to call me she. I ask people to use a different name for me. Call me Mara, right? Things like that. And the reason I did that is because it's like a fundamental part of who I am, right? And that's sort of true for every trans person. If someone's asking you to do that, I don't know if John Murphy is your legal name, but I'm going to call you John Murphy because you told me that's your name, and I'm going to respect it. I don't know if you're a trans guy, right? Like you can't always tell. Like I don't know like what your medical history is, but you want to be called he, so I'm going to call you he, right? And that's the way I kind of try and go through the world. But to not call people that, it's a way to disrespect people. It's a way to like belittle them. It's a way to, not treat them with dignity. And so being able to use like the bathroom that is like corresponding to the correct sex or gender, however we want to frame it or think about it, it's not really about protecting anyone, because these things, right? Again, like it's 6 or 7 out of 3 million people. Like I just want to use the bathroom, and I just want to use the bathroom and not be surrounded by men who sexually harass me or call me slurs or whatever, right? And so part of the way that they're trying to sort of crack down on us is there's this bill out that CFN put a statement on about trying to make all bathrooms on federal property you're required to use the the bathroom of your assigned sex at birth, right? And that's just in a way to like attack our dignity and like disrespect us and to like legally enforce our oppression.
One thing that's like really important about like this issue is that like I really do see this, especially given like very recent, very fresh, and quite intense and escalated management abuse and harassment, specifically targeting and trying to isolate me on the workroom floor in the last month and a half, if not longer. I've actually experienced this at multiple stations already in Pittsburgh. Yeah, I'm not going to try to go into detail right now. But yeah, I will tell you that like I'll tell all the audience members right now that like I definitely see this as a workplace issue that is incredibly connected to the question of wages, working conditions, etc. And I want to like, but that's like not always immediately clear. So I want to like draw that out a little bit because like why would we be like why would BFN like feel like it's so necessary to take on like a statement on this issue? Like why is it so important to take a stand, a clear, open, public stand against this bathroom bill that I see that it is an attack on federal workers, and it is trying to isolate trans people, trans workers, but federal trans workers from their coworkers, from their unions, etc. Especially in like a very, politically divisive and heating up moment around Trump 2.0. One way of looking at this is this trans bathroom bill, which is basically just saying, like, trans people, you can't use the restroom that is most comfortable and safe for you, and taking that choice out of our hands. This is a Trojan horse for like much larger like issues and a much larger assault on trans people more widely across the country and the world. Um, but also like and simultaneously it sort of acts as a Trojan horse like for the labor movement. I actually had a conversation with one of my Black working class coworkers recently where I was going over and discussing like what was going on with me, and like the targeted harassment I was receiving. And he had a really awesome point. And this guy has been a union steward. He's been doing the job for at least 10 years. He's fucking awesome. Love him. He brought up the point that he was very supportive of me, was standing by me, and like he brought up like, hey, yeah, like I think that you need to take a strong stand on this. I think we need to, because I see how if they're trying to get you out of this section, I was in his zip code section, they're gonna next try to get all the Black workers out of this section. And I absolutely believe, I mean, there might be something hyperbolic about that statement, but like also like that's not untrue. Like it's happened before in the workers movement and labor movement, and like it's not impossible that it would happen again, especially if we let these attacks go unanswered and we keep rolling back things. And to like address the question of like how this bill would even be enforced, which I'm sure Mara could say more about too, like it would require like actually I think Mara was actually kind of bringing up this point as well about like how we as any person could like, you know, block a trans person or anyone's gender. And it's like, well, we're not really interested, nor should we be interested in looking in anyone's pants and looking in their medical information or their private information and files. And like how this would be enforced would be like encouraging whether it be private citizens or management and supervisors to police their workers and demand information that they should not have access to. Because let's be honest, like who wants their boss to know any of that kind of information about any of us? I'm sure as hell don't.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's sort of like to make it very explicit, right? This bill demands, and certain other bills like it, like for sports and schools, because there's been like a lot of attacks on trans kids. So some of them have like literal provisions for we're going to inspect this child's genitals to make sure. And so this bill doesn't have any specific enforcement mechanism, but that's one of the ways they might enforce it, right? So if you're a woman with a strong jawline or a deep voice, but you're cis, this bill might come for you too, right? If you're a short guy, they might pull your pants down, right? Um, I think that's sort of outlining this. I think it's like I want to talk more generally about what are some problems which we've kind of all touched on of like being trans at the post office in general. I think the biggest thing, right, is like Kai's talked about this. She's had like a lot of really bad experiences with this, but I'm sure it's not unique to her. I've experienced a little bit of this where management does not respect you, does not use your correct name, does not use your correct pronouns. Management will tell you you can't use the right bathroom, right? Which is, by the way, at least for the time being, postal policy says management should use your name and your pronouns, whatever you say they are, and you should be allowed to use whatever bathroom you want. I think that's very important to remember. If you're a trans carrier, right? Now, end of the day, right, it depends on how much, your coworkers, the union is willing to fight for you and how much you're willing to fight for yourself and like, get together with people and fight for that. But according to the letter of the law, you can do that, right? And that's what I've said to the managers. Like, you have to do this. This is what your own document says. That's sort of a big thing, right? It's like management harassment, management disrespect. And like, to me, right, like if we want to get into all the contract stuff, like this is a joint statement question, right? We said like we're not going to make a hostile work environment. My manager is calling me he, or my manager is calling me. I mean, people don't know my name. My name's long been legally changed, but like, my old name. But if someone is new to it, someone comes out and they're still using their old name, and it's like it's one thing. I do want to be clear, right? It, you can tell when I think trans people have this. This is a shared experience, right? You can tell when someone slips up. It's an honest mistake, especially if someone's like come out recently. It makes sense. Like, it's a thing that happens, right? If you have known someone for a year by one name, they change their name, makes sense, right? They change the pronoun, makes sense that you're going to slip up, right? I mean, like, and like, I think for, you can kind of tell if you're a trans person when it's an honest mistake and someone's like genuinely trying to put in the effort and understand you versus they don't care, or worse, they're being hostile, right? It happens sometimes that they're being hostile. So management's the big thing, I think. But sometimes your coworkers are hostile too. I've been lucky enough that I haven't had anyone like be particularly unpleasant to me, but I'm sure people have had that experience. I've heard some stories. And I think like customers also, and I have had customers be unpleasant to me. I've had customers threaten to kill me, call me a fucking homo and things like that. And I know some people have had it worse. Like I mentioned before, Carrie that's been assaulted on her route and stuff like that. It can be very difficult. And I think the other thing that I think is important to think about with this stuff is it's often very lonely, right? I was briefly in a station where there are two or three other trans carriers, three total. But everywhere else, I've been the only trans person in my station. And I think that's pretty common for people. It's not a job that's particularly friendly to trans people. It's not a job that's but has a lot of, it has a lot of trans people, but like we're kind of spread out. I think like if you're a trans person, you know what I'm talking about. But if you're a cis person, I think it would be good to like reflect on what it would be like to be like the only person in a place that everyone knew something about, and you knew some people probably don't know exactly who don't like that, right?
Yeah, I can jump in here with a couple things. Yeah, that's really, really important stuff. And yeah, especially like this thing about loneliness, because social isolation and like to be clear, like it's all, even if it's sort of knock-on side effects of like these wider issues, like it's all like the tool of the bosses. This is how I see it, is like they would it benefits them and the billionaire class specifically. Like let's be clear about who the real enemy is here. It's not like our maybe slightly bigoted or maybe very bigoted like peers or like everyday ordinary people near us. It's like those people definitely like have fallen for some of the things that we want to like bring them away from, and like and link up fully and struggle together, and ultimately like that will require us like learning more about each other generally, like all of us doing that. But like the real, like the actual enemy who has like injected these ideas, these like rotten sick ideas into the workers movement, is the bosses, is the big bosses, the billionaires in this day and age. I think and like this loneliness, this like social isolation is like really like a chronic issue for so many people in the state, like the mental health crisis, and all the other crises under capitalism these days. Like it's a world that feels increasingly like things are not okay. We're all understanding things are not okay. And yet not a lot is yet being done about it, especially by the people like in charge of the world, right? Which is not us. It's not us ordinary people. It's not run democratically, even if that's a word that's often used to describe how like the U.S. legal system or whatever works. It's not. We know that it's run by money. Yeah, and I think just like to yeah, just like one last thing is like the union, like the basic function of the union is to protect its members, to defend against attacks from the bosses, to from harassment, from bullying, from management bullying, those kinds of things we see in all different like ways on the shop floor. And this is a pretty like almost like it seems like a new expression of it, but it's a very old thing, like singling a worker out, like trying to play favorites with some, playing, put a huge target on others. Like this is all old. It's all quite, to be honest, very old shit. It's not an ingenious invention. And I will say that the labor movement overall it's in a weak position right now. It's been like taking steps back and retreating over decades. It's only now in the last few years, like in its resurgence, like taking important steps forward, like really waking up. And I'm really excited about that. And the fact that the winds are blowing in the other direction and the labor movement is on the rise is really important for us to keep in mind. Generally, the union like unions in general, the labor movement has a role in fighting against these wider issues, just like even beyond the workplace, and the workroom floor. Because the thing is, like, workers and our members are all like affected by what's going on in the world. The stronger the union gets, the stronger the labor movement gets, the more we are able to take on the bigger things and play like a really progressive, and by progressive I just mean like a really useful, helpful role in, I don't know, changing the world for the betterment of all of our members. Like there's a lot of things that we do generally agree on, and I think we could be more clear about that, especially with a more active and well organized rank and file that's like taking part in all of these like mass discussions in the union, which we're not seeing happening right now in the NALC, but like we can, like that can absolutely happen. And it yeah, and honestly, even like the medium term, like not that too long, like we're taking good steps towards.
Yeah. So just to build off that, I think like if we're talking about what it would take to sort of change this climate for trans people, I think sort of number one is having a fighting union, right? And having a fighting, and I think that starts on the workroom floor. Like that starts with fighting for your coworkers, not just on trans issues, but on all issues, right? If, we all know, right, that management loves to fuck with the CCAs and PTS, right? They love to lie to them. They love to tell them, oh yeah, you can work 15 hours. You got to make sure you're talking to the new CCAs and the new PTS and telling them, like, no, you don't. And you can tell them not to, just as one example, right? Management loves to lie. The more we build up on like all these things, right, the more we're capable of learning that, like, if we have a workroom floor, if we have a station, right, that everyone's kind of going behind each other's backs, trying to get in with management, that sort of thing, the harder it's going to be to fight. Whereas if we have a united workroom, a united station that's ready to push back when management tries to mess with us, that has each other's back. And so to that, if you're a trans person, you got to talk to your coworkers. You got to make friends with your coworkers. And I know that's hard. I'm not like by nature the most social person, right? I'm definitely someone that's like a push for me, especially when I'm in a setting where like I'm the only trans person and I know everyone knows that, right? That's tough. But that is sort of, that's what you got to do. And like, if there's anyone, I would be shocked if anyone from my station was listening to this. I'm still pretty new there, but if I haven't talked to you and you're from my station and you're listening to this, hi, come say hi. I want to be your friend. We have to, work to develop solidarity. So that means learning about people and like helping them fight for their issues. I think the other thing you can do as a trans person is like learn your rights, do research on the contract, do research on the law. It seems like, already as of 2 days ago, the law is already changing. We'll see how much of that gets enforced. But, there's this big executive order that's making me really regret not changing my passport sooner. But yeah, like read the policies, be prepared to show them to management because, as we've said, management loves to lie. They don't know the policy. They'll just tell you based on their knee-jerk reaction. right? So if you have a shitty manager like Kai does, and they decide that they don't like trans people, and they say, you can't use this bathroom, or you can't do this, or you can't do that, be ready to respond to that. That response goes a much longer way if it's not just you saying it, but it's you and all your coworkers. If you're a cis person, first off, obviously, refer to people with the correct pronouns. Refer to people, um, by their correct name. Treat them with respect. Be nice to them. I think, like, in terms of pronouns, right? Like, I do kind of think, like, you can kind of tell what people are going for. Like, being trans is kind of like, you know, I don't really, I haven't had to really tell that many people my pronouns, even though I am visibly trans, because I think people kind of tell what I'm going for, right? But if you're not sure, you're genuinely not sure, you should ask, and it's fine. You have pronouns too, also, just so you know. Everyone has them, right? Just to the side, right? If you go by he, those are your pronouns. If you go by she, those are your pronouns. Go by they, those are your pronouns. I think there's that, but also, stand up for people. It can be really lonely and isolating if you're the only trans person, boss is bothering you. You want to build solidarity, right? And that builds a stronger union, right? It builds a stronger union for all of us. And I think, like, one of my favorite books is the book Stone Butch Blues. It's about a trans person in the union, and it was written in the early 90s. It talks about how when the union didn't step up for trans people, it weakened the union, right? The union didn't step up for gay people, it weakened the union. And I think the other thing, when someone specifically asked me to mention this, right, is like, you can't always know, like, sometimes people are visibly trans, sometimes they're not. And I think if you know someone's trans, you have to be careful how you have to make sure you're referring to them correctly, especially in the context of customers. I think part of the reason for this, right, is because you don't know how these interactions go. You don't know how customers are in the street. I think for the most part, people at the post office are professional. I've had certain negative experiences, but I think people interact with their coworkers at least on a professional level. But if you're on the street, right, someone doesn't like trans people, they might lose their shit. You have to make sure, if you're talking about someone with a customer, you're talking about another carrier, you don't, like, out them without them giving you permission to do that. Now, I'm very proud to be trans. I'm very happy to be trans. And, I have no, sort of, like, shame about it. I'm very happy to talk about being trans. But I also, like, there's definitely times where it makes things go smoother if people don't know you're trans, right? People have followed me on the street when I'm at work. People have, like I mentioned before, right? They sort of determined I was trans and threatened me. And so, like, if you're talking about your trans coworker, just tell people what they want you to tell them.
I'm hoping we can all get together again and keep this going as a permanent position on the podcast. I also want to say, if you're straight and you're in an office with a trans or even just a queer, just reach out to them, like, get to know. I feel like maybe it's just my office, but I feel like the post office is very individualized. Like, you don't really know your coworkers. Like, we're separated by metal cases, and some offices don't even have office breaks. You hardly know the person. And before you could even pass a judgment, introduce yourself. Find out, like, what their background is. Like, find out if they drink coffee or, like, eat pizza, and if they put pineapple on their pizza, maybe not be friends with them. I think the most important thing I want to say right now is for the folks across every office. Like, you could be in an office with 3 people, and imagine like a woman in an office with 2 other dudes that are too aggressive. Like, they're gonna be quiet. And then you're in a big office where it's, like, divided, and everyone speaks English, and English is your second language. You're gonna feel isolated as well. We're all in this together, and the most important thing is to build solidarity amongst our workforce. That's the only way we could rebuild our union. And if you are in a position to help someone, you've done what a union member should do. You practice solidarity. Injury to one is an injury to all. And before we wrap up, if there's anyone listening that wants to reach out, please do. My email is johnmurphysays, SAYS, @gmail.com, and I could connect you with Mara and Kai and
Yeah.
have everyone connected. And is there a platform for anyone that is listening?
Yeah. So I guess what I want to say is if you're trans and at the post office, you're by yourself in your office, you're listening to this, you're not alone. We do have a WhatsApp group that I could add you to. My email is Cahill, Chill, Mara, Marat @gmail.com. One word, no caps, no spaces. What I'll also say, and you can email me, and I will be more than happy to, and maybe John can put that link in the bio. The other thing I'll say is like, if you really hate trans people and you're convinced we're all, evil pedophiles trying to ruin the world, don't talk to me, don't email me. But if you're someone who is maybe not so sure and wants to have like a respectful conversation or whatever, I'm happy to talk about it. Please don't be weird, but talk to me like a normal person. But anyway, that's all I have to say.
Solidarity.
Solidarity, y'all.
Solidarity. This was great.